There are places in history where truth feels stranger than fiction, where whispers outlast the echoes of gunfire, and where one family's shame becomes an entire town's secret. Montana in the late 1800s was a land of isolation, survival, and superstition, but among its frontier towns came a story so disturbing that locals refused to speak of it aloud. This was not about outlaws, nor the violence of cattle rustlers, but something far quieter, something that defied nature itself. It was about a boy who never grew older than 11, a boy trapped in time, whose existence became both a haunting and a curse. The frozen child became the most whispered tale of Montana in 1883, a figure who seemed to hover between the realm of the living and something beyond, something unnatural that even the most skeptical men and women could not easily dismiss. The boy who never aged past 11 stood as a defiance against the very laws of nature, against the certainty that all things must change, must grow, must decay, and must eventually die. Yet there he was, year after year, appearing no different from the last. His hair remained the same length and shade, never graying, never thinning, never even seeming to require the shears. His skin held the smooth pallor of youth, untouched by the sun's harsh kiss or the scars that usually came with childhood play. To look at him was to feel unease, for it was not simply that he looked young, it was that he seemed frozen in a moment of time that no one could understand. A photograph come to life, a living relic of a single year stretched endlessly into the future. At first, his condition inspired a mix of curiosity and pity among the townsfolk. They wondered if he might someday begin to grow again, if perhaps some ailment had paused his development but would release him in time. Doctors, limited as they were on the frontier, examined him with fascination, scribbling notes that would vanish into dusty journals no one would ever publish. Families brought him food and small gifts, treating him as though he were fragile, as though he might shatter under the weight of a single hard word. But as the months stretched into years and the years into decades, that pity soured into dread. The boy's eternal youth was no blessing. It was a living reminder that something was terribly wrong, that he was no longer just a child of flesh and blood, but a creature bound by rules no one understood. Children who once played alongside him grew tall, their voices cracked, their faces transformed by the march of time. Yet whenever they passed him on the dusty street or caught a glimpse of him staring from a window, they saw the same unchanged face they had known at their own age of 11. Former playmates became adults with families of their own, and still the boy's figure lingered unchanged, watching silently as though mocking them with his refusal to join in the natural rhythm of life. Those who had been kind to him at first began to avoid him, crossing the street when they saw him coming, muttering prayers beneath their breath. Parents forbade their children from speaking to him, warning that something unholy clung to his presence, something that could spread if one lingered too long in his company. The boy became a spectre in plain sight, a figure who walked among the living yet belonged to no world they understood. The isolation of Montana only deepened the mystery. News traveled slowly, and outsiders rarely lingered long enough to take note of the strange boy in town. When they did, the locals discouraged questions, shutting down conversations before they could begin. The few outsiders who did inquire further often left unsettled, speaking of how the boy's eyes seemed to hold centuries rather than years, how his voice carried a hollow quality, as though it came from a distance rather than from his own throat. These accounts, scattered in letters and second-hand tales, eventually fed into folklore, but to the people of the town, there was nothing romantic about the legend. It was simply a reality they had learned to endure in silence, a weight pressing down upon them every time they saw that unchanged face. Some believed he was a punishment sent upon the family, a curse passed down from sins long forgotten. Others whispered of bargains made under moonlit skies, of rituals performed in secret to cheat death, rituals that had gone horribly wrong. The boy's family never spoke of it openly, though their wearied expressions and shuttered windows told a story of shame and exhaustion. They tried to hide him at times, keeping him inside for weeks or months, but inevitably he would be seen again, unchanged, his presence impossible to deny. The silence of the family mirrored the silence of the town, each complicit in maintaining a secret that grew heavier with every passing year. The unnatural stillness of the boy's form unsettled even the most hardened men. Ranchers who had faced wolves, blizzards, and outlaws confessed to feeling a chill run down their spines when the boy's gaze fell upon them. He did not smile, nor laugh, nor weep as other children did. His voice remained soft and flat, his movements slow, deliberate, lacking the energy of youth. He was a child without childhood, a figure locked outside the normal flow of life. Some described it as though he were watching the world from the other side of a glass pane, present yet disconnected, aware yet untouched. And as the decades passed, this sense only deepened, leaving those who saw him with the unsettling impression that he was not living in their world at all, but merely haunting it. Rumors spread in hushed tones, spoken only behind closed doors. Some claimed he was not truly a boy at all, but something inhabiting the shape of a boy, wearing his skin as a disguise. Others insisted he was immortal, cursed to linger on earth as a reminder of sins too great to be forgiven. Still others argued that he was a warning, that his presence meant something dark hovered just beyond the horizon, waiting for its moment to strike. Each theory was darker than the last, but all agreed on one thing: he was not normal, and his existence was not meant to be. Would you like me to continue this keynote into a second-half expansion to reach the full 800 words in a single continuous flow? Or should I move on to keynote 2 side once this one is complete? The silence that wrapped itself around the boy's presence became more terrifying than his condition itself, for silence on the frontier was not ordinary. Settlers lived in a world where voices carried far, where neighbors relied on each other, where gossip traveled faster than the stagecoach. And yet when it came to him, mouths closed, eyes averted, and whole conversations died before they had a chance to form. It was not just a matter of courtesy or avoidance. It was as if the entire town had struck an unspoken pact that his name and his existence were not to be discussed. When strangers passed through, they might notice the quiet boy and ask about him, but the locals would deflect, giving vague replies, changing subjects, or simply refusing to answer. This silence became as chilling as any scream, a heavy curtain that concealed more than words ever could, and it gave the boy an aura darker than any curse, because silence itself is a form of complicity. At church gatherings, his family arrived late and sat in the back pews, and no preacher dared speak of the strangeness in their household. Sermons bent themselves in twisted shapes to avoid making references to the passage of time or the growth of children, for even the language of Scripture could become dangerous if it invited comparison to the boy who had ceased to grow. When the congregation spilled out onto the churchyard, there was laughter and handshakes, discussions of crops and weather, but if someone turned their eyes toward the pale figure who lingered in his parents' shadow, that laughter would fall away, replaced by that dreadful silence, as though everyone feared that to name him was to invite disaster upon themselves. This hush extended into the homes of the townsfolk. Around dinner tables, families could speak of hardships, deaths, and even scandal, but the boy was never spoken of, not even in whispers among siblings once the lamps were blown out. It was as if he had been erased from the tongue, a forbidden word whose utterance might draw something unnatural into the room. Children who dared ask their parents about him were quickly hushed, sometimes slapped into obedience, as if even curiosity was a danger too great to risk. This suppression only magnified the horror, because what people will not name grows larger in the imagination, turning into something monstrous that lives in the corners of the mind. Travelers who stayed overnight noticed it too. They might sit in the saloon drinking whiskey and telling stories when one would mention seeing a boy outside, watching quietly, his face unchanging, his body thin and stiff. The moment those words left their lips, the mood in the saloon would change. Dice would stop rolling, chairs would scrape back, and conversations would die. Some locals would simply leave, others would shake their heads and mutter, but no one would explain. It was not just disinterest, it was a collective refusal, a wall built by silence, stronger than any law, more binding than any oath. The traveler would be left unsettled, realizing that what they had seen was no ordinary child, but something the town itself was terrified to put into words. The boy seemed aware of this silence, for he carried it with him wherever he went. His footsteps made no noise on wooden floors. His presence stilled the air in a room, and even animals seemed disturbed by him, their ears flattening, their bodies pulling away. Dogs would not bark, but instead whimper softly and hide, as though the sound of aggression itself had been muted in his presence. Horses shifted uneasily, refusing to stand still if he drew near. Birds fell quiet when he walked beneath trees, the natural chorus of life pausing as if the earth itself recognized what men would not speak aloud. What made the silence more unbearable was the way time exaggerated it. A year of unspoken fear can be endured, even 10 years perhaps, but decades of muteness around the boy's presence turned the hush into a form of generational inheritance. Those who were children when the silence began grew into adults who had learned to avoid questions, and their own children inherited the same behavior. It was a silence passed like a family heirloom, binding the entire community in an unbreakable grip. The boy remained 11, but the silence aged alongside the people, tightening around them until it became second nature, a ritual as unshakable as prayer or superstition. There were darker moments, times when the silence broke in unsettling ways. Sometimes a drunk, emboldened by too much whiskey, would mutter a cruel word in the boy's direction, calling him an abomination or a devil's spawn. But the reaction from the room was never laughter or agreement. It was anger, fear, and swift rebuke. Not out of kindness for the boy, but out of terror that naming him aloud might bring a reckoning. On rare occasions, children would tease him, daring one another to ask him his age, but those children often went home shaken, describing the way he looked at them with eyes that did not blink, eyes that seemed to know more than a boy should. Their parents would scold them harshly, forbidding them from ever speaking of it again, sealing the silence back into place with threats and fear. The silence became so deeply rooted that even after people left the town and built lives elsewhere, they carried it with them. Some never spoke of the boy again, burying the memory so deeply that even their descendants would not know what had haunted them. Others, when pressed by curiosity in their old age, would let slip only fragments. A strange boy, always 11, never aging, a hush that followed him, a town too frightened to speak. These fragments, scattered in diaries and letters, never gave the whole story, only hints, as though even across distance and years, the silence still clung to their throats. Would you like me to continue in the same flow for Keynote 3 next, keeping the same eerie, uninterrupted narration style stretched to 800 words, or do you want me to refine this one first to ensure it perfectly matches your storytelling voice? The family of the boy bore the heaviest burden, for within their home lay the greatest concentration of whispers, rumors, and fear. From the outside, their cabin looked no different from the others scattered across the rugged Montana landscape, but behind its wooden walls was a secret that consumed them. Neighbors often remarked on the shuttered windows that seemed always drawn, even in the heat of summer, as though the family wished to blot out both the sun and the gaze of their community. Few ever visited, and those who did returned with uneasy stories of how time seemed to stand still inside, of how the air was thick and heavy, and of how the boy's presence turned the atmosphere suffocating. It was within these walls that the family's silence grew into something darker, a desperate attempt to contain what could not be controlled. They rarely spoke of him even among themselves, though his existence shaped every corner of their lives. When neighbors asked after their son, the parents would smile weakly and change the subject, pretending he was away or ill, anything to avoid explaining what he truly was. Some claimed the mother wept often in private, her tears a constant admission of guilt she could never confess, while the father grew hard and bitter, his face carved into a mask of silence that no one dared to penetrate. The siblings, if they had any, seemed to carry a shadow over them too, their childhood spent in the strange awareness that their brother was not like other children, that he was caught in some endless loop of youth while their own bodies betrayed them with growth and change. Speculation grew, as it always does in the absence of truth. Some believed the family had made a pact with something beyond this world, a bargain struck in desperation during a season of famine or disease, a plea for life that had gone horribly wrong. The boy, they said, was the cost of that bargain, forever denied the chance to grow, a reminder that no deal with the unnatural comes without consequence. Others suggested the family was cursed, their bloodline tainted by some long-forgotten sin, and that the boy's frozen age was proof of divine wrath. There were even whispers of witchcraft, of midnight rituals carried out by the mother in her youth, rituals she had abandoned but that had clung to her offspring with cruel precision. The boy's condition in this telling was the residue of some forbidden prayer or hidden sacrifice. The family endured these rumors in silence, though the strain wore them thin. At gatherings, they were treated with a politeness so stiff it bordered on fear, as though everyone wanted to keep them close enough to observe but distant enough to protect themselves. Invitations dwindled, friendships dried up, and soon they became isolated, a family within a town yet apart from it. Every decision they made seemed to revolve around concealing the boy's condition, though their efforts were futile, for he was seen often enough to keep the rumors alive. Children caught glimpses of him at windows, his pale face staring out with an emptiness that sent shivers down their spines. Adults swore they saw him wandering the fields at dusk, his thin form cutting a silhouette against the dying light, always the same height, always the same slight shoulders, as if carved into permanence by some cruel sculptor. Inside the home, life grew tense and unnatural. There were reports of visitors who claimed they never heard laughter, never heard the usual noise of a child playing or speaking with siblings. Instead, there was a quiet that seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by the low voices of the parents or the creak of the floorboards under the boy's slow, deliberate steps. Meals were said to be joyless affairs taken in silence, with the boy eating little, his gaze fixed somewhere far away. His presence weighed heavily on the family, pressing them into a kind of living tomb where normal life could not exist. It was not simply his unchanging appearance that frightened them, but the sense that he was aware of his condition, that he understood far too much for someone who should have still been innocent. His eyes, always calm, always steady, gave the impression of knowledge beyond his years, knowledge that no child should hold. As the years passed, the family's desperation grew. Some said they attempted to leave Montana, to take the boy elsewhere in the hope that distance might dull the whispers, but each attempt seemed to end with them returning, as though something tethered them to the land. Others believed they sought out healers and priests, bringing strangers into their home in secret, hoping for deliverance. These outsiders rarely stayed long, and when they left, they did so quickly, shaken and unwilling to speak of what they had witnessed. One account, found in a letter decades later, described a priest who refused to step foot in the house again after a single night, claiming the boy's presence was an affront to the natural order, a thing neither holy water nor prayer could touch. The weight of such secrecy gnawed at the family, twisting them in ways that made their suffering visible even to those who avoided them. The father was seen drinking more heavily, his once strong body withering under the strain, while the mother's face seemed frozen in grief, as though mourning a child who was alive yet already lost. The siblings, if any remained, grew resentful, burdened by the endless comparison to a brother who never changed, who never grew, who never bore the struggles they did. They aged into adulthood while he stayed behind, a phantom reminder of youth they could never reclaim. Their resentment, though unspoken, bled into every interaction, every strained glance across the dinner table. The family secrets became a poison, not only binding them, but infecting the entire community with unease. Their silence fueled the town's silence, and together it created a cycle that no one could break. The boy's eternal childhood was not simply his curse, but theirs as well, a reminder that some truths are too heavy to carry and too dangerous to share. Those who lived near the family claimed that over time, the very air around their cabin grew different, as though the land itself resisted them. Crops failed more often on their plot, animals avoided their fields, and the ground seemed to resist giving them the bounty it offered others. The family bore this misfortune in silence, never complaining, never asking for help, as though they believed their suffering was deserved, as though it was penance for the secret they carried. The boy's stillness became a thing more frightening than the mere fact that he did not age, for it was not the stillness of calm, but of something unnatural, a quiet that carried weight, a quiet that unsettled even in the most ordinary moments. Other children fidgeted, laughed, and darted about with endless energy, their bodies restless with the hunger of youth, but he did not. He sat in one place for hours, unmoving except for the occasional slow blink of his eyes, as though he had no need of movement at all. When he walked, it was not with the uneven clumsiness of a boy, but with the measured, deliberate steps of someone far older, each movement deliberate and calculated, as if he knew the earth itself watched him. His voice, when he used it, lacked the innocence of childhood tones, carrying instead a hollow resonance that gave listeners the impression they were hearing words spoken through a thin veil. There was nothing violent about him, nothing outwardly threatening, yet his very existence was unsettling in a way that words failed to capture, and it was this macabre stillness that unsettled the townspeople more than anything else. When he entered a room, laughter dimmed, conversation slowed, and people found themselves lowering their voices without meaning to. The sense was not that of respect, but of unease, as though his presence demanded quiet without ever asking for it. Those who sat near him for too long spoke later of how the air felt heavy, how their hearts beat slower, and how time itself seemed to stretch. minutes dragging into hours under the weight of his gaze. No one could explain why this happened, only that it did, and it made people flee his company as quickly as they could without appearing rude. To sit with him too long was to feel as if one were being drained, as if life itself flowed out silently into the void he carried with him. Animals reacted with the same uncanny awareness. Cats that prowled the edges of homesteads would stop suddenly when he appeared, their fur rising, their bodies freezing in unnatural silence before darting away. Dogs did not bark at him, which was strange enough, but neither did they approach, instead curling back their lips in a low whine and retreating with tails tucked between their legs. Horses, usually patient with the clumsy affections of children, would buck and resist his touch, their eyes rolling wide with the terror of something unseen. The stillness he radiated did not belong to childhood nor to humanity as they knew it, but to something outside the natural order, and even creatures of instinct could sense what human tongues dared not speak aloud. Neighbors who lived closest to the boy's family swore they heard strange sounds at night, not the cries of a child nor the restless movements of youth, but the eerie quiet of someone awake in the dark, moving slowly through the house at unnatural hours. Sometimes, they said, they would see him at the window when the moon was high, standing perfectly still with his face pressed to the glass, his eyes reflecting pale silver in the light. He did not twitch, he did not move, and he did not appear to breathe, as though he were a figure carved of stone. When dawn came, he was often still there, unchanged, as if he had never left the spot. These sightings spread fear, but not one neighbor dared confront the family about it, for to speak of it aloud was to break the unspoken rule of silence that had taken root in the town. Those who looked too long into his eyes came away shaken, for they swore that behind the youthful face lay something ancient, something that had no place in a body so small. His gaze did not wander like that of children who were easily distracted, nor did it shine with curiosity or mischief. Instead, it was steady, unyielding, and hollow, like staring into a well with no bottom. There were those who claimed his eyes carried knowledge, as though he remembered things he should not, things far older than the town, older than the land, and older than the people who walked it. Men who had faced violence and war admitted to feeling powerless under that gaze, as though the boy could see straight through them, peeling away all pretenses until nothing but raw fear remained. Even the passing of seasons did nothing to break the impression of his stillness. Winters came and went, snow piling high against cabins, spring thawing the earth, summers bringing heat and dust, and autumn painting the land in crimson and gold. But through it all, the boy remained the same. He wore the same coat each winter, though it never seemed to wear thin, and when the heat of summer arrived, he seemed untouched by sweat or sunburn. While others grew gaunt with hunger during lean years or weathered by the endless labor of survival, he stayed as he was, his body immune to the elements, his face untouched by hardship. This constancy, this resistance to change, made his stillness even more unbearable, for he seemed not only outside of time, but outside of the suffering that defined human existence. Whispers began to circle that his stillness was not simply a condition but a warning, that he was like a statue placed in the midst of the town as a reminder of sins unspoken, that his unmoving form was a living omen. Some said he was waiting for something, that his silence and his lack of growth were not accidents, but part of a larger design that none of them could comprehend. Others believed he was not waiting but watching, that his gaze and his stillness were part of some cruel ritual, that he fed not on food, but on the fear and unease of those around him. Whatever the truth, the effect was the same. The people of the town grew afraid of lingering too long near him, of letting their eyes meet his, of allowing his stillness to seep into them. For once it did, they swore it lingered even after he was gone, clinging like a shadow that could not be shaken. Fragments of the boy's story survive in ways as haunting as his presence itself, scattered like ashes through letters, journals, and whispered recollections that never dared to take full shape. History is usually built from records, from names carved into stone or words preserved with pride. But his story comes only in pieces, half-sentences and notes written on the margins of old diaries, lines that trail off as though the writer grew too uneasy to continue. It is in these fragments that the shadow of his existence lingers, not in the bold statements of fact, but in the careful avoidance, in the hints left behind by those who feared that naming him too clearly might draw his gaze back upon them. The boy who never aged past 11 remains suspended not only in his own frozen body, but in history itself, never allowed to take full form, always glimpsed from the edges of silence. One such letter, written by a traveler who passed through Montana in 1887, spoke of a child he saw standing at the edge of a field. The man described how he thought the boy must be lost, for he stood alone, unmoving, watching the wheat bend under the wind. When the traveler greeted him, the boy turned, and what struck him was not his appearance, but the overwhelming impression that time itself faltered around him. The man confessed that his horse refused to approach, and that he himself could not stand to linger more than a moment before unease forced him to move on. The letter ends abruptly, the handwriting shifting into a scrawl, as though the writer no longer wished to dwell on the memory. This pattern repeats again and again in the surviving accounts. People begin to speak of him but break off, their words collapsing under the weight of what they cannot bring themselves to say. Local journals kept by ranching families tell the same story, though always indirectly. One entry might note that a child's appearance had unsettled livestock, another that a neighbor's son had frightened their daughter with strange stories of an unchanging boy. Never is his name written, never is the family described in detail, but the pattern is unmistakable. These are not the kinds of stories passed down with pride, but the kinds that slip through cracks, leaving behind enough traces that those who study them know something was being avoided. The absence of direct words becomes its own testimony, for in history, silence speaks louder than invention, and here the silence is overwhelming. As years rolled forward, the fragments carried beyond Montana, carried by those who left the region but could not quite leave behind the shadow of the boy. In the memoir of a woman who moved to Oregon later in life, she described her childhood home only vaguely, but within her words was a telling passage. She recalled a boy who lived near her, who never grew older, who frightened her so deeply that she had nightmares well into adulthood. She did not call him by name, nor even state his town, but the timing, the age, and the details matched too closely to be dismissed as coincidence. It is in these faint echoes that the boy's presence reaches into the wider tapestry of folklore, surfacing where least expected, like a chill wind that slips under the door even when the house is shut tight. The most haunting part of these fragments is their consistency. Accounts written years apart by people who never knew each other carry the same details. A boy of 11, unchanging, silent, with eyes too knowing and a presence that pressed down like a weight. The repetition suggests that this was no ordinary rumor that shifted with retelling, but something more rooted, something that held itself steady across generations, just as the boy himself remained steady across time. It was as though the very nature of his existence resisted alteration, freezing not only his body but the stories that formed around him, holding them in eerie stasis. Even lies, in this case, refused to evolve, for every account carried the same core, as though his truth was too heavy to bend. Historians who stumble upon these fragments find themselves unsettled, not by what is written, but by what is missing. A name should exist, a grave should have been dug, a record should be found, yet none appear. The census rolls list, families, children born and children lost, but within these lists there is only emptiness where he should have been. It is as if he existed outside the ledger of life, uncounted, unnamed, and unclaimed by the flow of history. This absence leaves researchers with a sense of unease, for history does not often lose track of children, and yet here was one who slipped entirely through the cracks, preserved only in half-remembered nightmares and fragments never meant to be read by strangers. Even the folklore that surrounds him bears this unfinished quality. While other legends grow with time, gathering flourishes of exaggeration and embellishment, the boy's story resists such growth. It never grows more dramatic, never gains the fantastical additions that mark tall tales. Instead, it repeats itself like a broken record, the boy, 11, unchanged, silent, unsettling. It is as if the story itself is bound by the same strange laws that bound his body, unable to move forward, unable to transform. This gives the legend a peculiar weight, for it does not feel like a tale crafted for entertainment, but like a burden carried reluctantly, repeated only when forced, and always in hushed tones. What lingers most from these historical shadows is the impression that the boy was not only real, but that he left behind a wound in the memory of those who encountered him. They did not exaggerate him into myth, nor did they fully erase him, but they left enough behind to ensure that his presence was never entirely lost. His story clings to history like frost that refuses to melt, thin and fragile, yet impossible to ignore. The fragments are enough to make him known, but never enough to make him understood, leaving him forever trapped not only in his body but in the space between truth and legend, between history and horror.